We start as we have always started these last several days with a health update for Pope Francis before we dive into this news about the USCCB basically destroying their own case for helping, as they see it, with refugee resettlement and the rest. So we start with an update on Francis, and we go just to Raymond Arroyo. A lot of places have posted this, but Raymond Arroyo is most people watching a channel like this aren't going to have a problem with him. So here's what he had to say. He said, Pope Francis had, quote, a sudden worsening condition. He's been placed on mechanical ventilation. From the Holy See press office, the Holy Father this morning, after a morning spent alternating respiratory physiotherapy with prayer in the chapel, presented an isolated attack of bronchospasm, which, however, this resulted in an episode of throwing up with inhalation and a sudden worsening of the respiratory condition. The Holy Father was promptly bronchoaspirated and began non-invasive mechanical ventilation with a good response on gas exchange. The Holy Father remained alert and oriented at all times, collaborating in the therapeutic maneuvers. The prognosis, therefore, remains reserved. He received Holy Communion this morning. That was yesterday. That's not good. That is not you. Unless the only person you ever want to go through something like that is yourself. If you so choose to understand that in your final days, you have the opportunity, a grace that is hard for the modern mind to really comprehend, a modern mind that flees from suffering. You have a grace, an opportunity to unite your sufferings to make up for the unpaid debt of sin in your life before you stand before our Lord, to shave off that purgatory time, essentially. And the only person you would ever wish that on would be yourself, that you take it on voluntarily. You certainly don't wish this on anybody else. And I've heard just anecdotally from registered nurses on X and things that that's not typically, these are the kind of things that people typically don't come back from. Now, I said yesterday he had 2 or 3 days in a row of improving conditions. And I was wasn't joking, but it was unfortunate when I said, we'll see, because oftentimes at these end of life situations, you have people show days and days of improvement and then a sudden downturn. And that's exactly what had happened. And this is not a "I told you so" moment. It's that this is unfortunately predictable. Now, while I tend to be optimistic that he will make a recovery, we shall see. We shall see indeed. So that is his health update. And his health woes are, of course, dominating the news in the church today, and frankly, for obvious reasons. But because of that focus, there have been stories getting lost in the shuffle. And amazingly enough, the story of the U.S. bishops taking U.S. government money for anti-Catholic and anti-civilizational purposes is one that got lost in the shuffle. I didn't see really anybody talk about this yesterday when the story broke, because we got a big update. The U.S. bishops, of course, decided to jump the shark by suing the U.S. government after the president suspended all their funding for asylum-seeking resettlement and all the rest of it. I reported on that a few days ago when it happened. Legal cases like this can take months and months to resolve. Amazingly enough, that lawsuit, well, strictly speaking, hasn't been resolved. It has resulted in a situation the U.S. bishops can't possibly come back from. It's not that the two sides came to an agreement and decided to hash things out outside of court, which some would argue would be the reasonable thing to do. Nor did the U.S. bishops get concessions from the government. Instead, it turns out that the bishops violated the terms of the contract that they had with the government, and the USCCB has had their government contract canceled by the U.S. government. That's what we call a big oops. So we go to the pillar for this headline: State Department terminates USCCB migration funds. Dated February 27th. If, as many of you watched Liz Yore talking about Vatican funding from the U.S. government, and she posited that it's upwards of 80% of their total funds come from the U.S. government, directly or indirectly from non-governmental organizations. If that number is even close to accurate, then this is catastrophic for not just the church in America, but the church broadly. It's catastrophic because the catastrophic decision was actually made decades ago when the Vatican decided to get to get really cozy with the U.S. government and didn't keep any relationship they had with them that may have at the time been an okay thing to have at arm's distance. Instead, they got cozier and cozier and cozier with them over time, as you're going to see as we go over this article. And when you see the details of the story, you might have the same reaction that I had. Either the U.S. bishops hired absolute morons for their legal team because their legal team would tell them that suing the government would result in their contract being canceled. It's not hard to see how that would happen here. Or the U.S. bishops decided they had more to gain financially by taking the government to court. That this whole issue isn't really about the plight of migrants and asylum seekers who legitimately need help in some circumstances when they're trying to, say, escape the bad guys from south of the border. Either way you cut it, the bishops decided to mess around, and now they are finding out, to borrow and sanitize a popular but crude saying that's kind of dominating political discourse these days, especially if you saw what happened at the White House yesterday. That's another topic for another time. But let's get some details from the pillar so you'll see what we're talking about. Quote, the State Department canceled a contract with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on Thursday, likely bringing to a halt a nationwide effort organized by the USCCB to provide resettlement services for refugees to the United States. The cancellation leaves uncertain the status of a USCCB lawsuit aiming to recoup millions in back payments resettlement services, with the federal government telling a judge that the USCCB should seek payment through, quote, available administrative channels outside the lawsuit. In a February 26th letter, U.S. State Department Comptroller Joseph Kuba told the USCCB that its financial agreement for refugee resettlement is, quote, immediately terminated as of February 27th, 2025, because the grant no longer effectuates agency priorities. Effective immediately upon receipt of this notice of termination, the recipient must stop all work on the program and not incur any new costs after the effective date cited above. Payment requests for legitimate costs incurred prior to this notification are allowable. The government's decision came after the USCCB filed February 18th a lawsuit which challenged a federal decision to suspend federal funding for refugee assistance programs administered by various Catholic charity outlets across the country, with the USCCB distributing funds and serving as coordinator of the programs. Let's pause here. And that's where the USCCB takes a small cut when they do that. For their administrative costs, you can say. What is it's a subsidy of essentially until very recently, non-canonical governing body for the Church in the United States. Because the USCCB was an invention of Cardinal Bernardin back when it was the National Catholic Bishops' Conference. Before Vatican II, you didn't have this stuff. This is all more of the church moving in the direction of being an NGO and being managed like it's a secular nonprofit organization. Before Vatican II, the bishops ran their dioceses and they would meet periodically as a body for each country on some major issue they had to deal with, but that was once every several years, not annually, and they certainly didn't make policy the way they do now. According to the lawsuit, the U.S. bishops have been awarded federal funds since 1980 to provide, quote, vetted and approved refugees with, quote, transitional supportive housing and employment search assistance during their first 90 days in the U.S. The bishops argued that refugees have a legally established right to federally funded resettlement assistance, quote, which is essential to helping them establish a new home. Again, this isn't temporary what they're doing. This is permanent. Resettlement help, quote, promote the successful settlement of refugees in their communities, including by promoting gainful employment or connections to educational opportunities, thereby diminishing the likelihood that newly arrived refugees will be dependent on ongoing public support, the conference argued. The Trump administration decision to freeze resettlement programs that bishops said was illegal and should be overturned by a judge. The bishops also argued that the federal government owed them more than $20 million for services completed in recent months and should be compelled to pay according to the terms of its contracts. While the lawsuit was just getting underway, a federal judge last week denied a USCCB request that funding should be reinstated, including for back pay, while the lawsuit made its way through the court. Judge Trevor McFadden ruled February 20th that the conference had not shown that reinstating the funds during the lawsuit's course was necessary to avoid, quote, irreparable harm to the bishops' conference, end quote. Yeah, good job, U.S. bishops. Wonderful. Good job on how you handled this. Now, the full text of the letter from the State Department was posted to X yesterday. And so what I'm about to show you is actually real. This is the real letter, and it basically spells out doom for the USCCB's efforts to continue to undermine the social stability of the United States, especially when you consider how much money they've received just since 2009. They've received like over $6 billion. And every time investigators look into that number and start looking at the network of NGOs that were getting money and then giving it to the US bishops, that number always goes up. So $6 billion is just the number as of March 1st. So here is the actual PDF of the actual letter that the U.S. State Department sent to them. this is an amazing letter. It says on February 26, 2025, the State Department notified the plaintiff, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, that its cooperative agreements were immediately terminated as of February 27th because the award no longer effectuates agency priorities. The State Department's termination agreements underlying this dispute now plainly put this matter into the realm of a contract dispute seeking more than $10,000, which falls within the exclusive jurisdiction of the Court of Federal Claims under the Tucker Act. That is, the termination of agreements leaves open only a question of unpaid money under the cooperative agreements. And to the extent the plaintiff disputes any reimbursement, the dispute needs to be brought in the Court of Federal Claims. Even could the court have entertained injunctive relief under the Administrative Procedure Act to compel the State Department to take some action under the agreements during their lifetimes, any such jurisdiction is now clearly absent, as there is no action the court could compel the parties' agreements are no longer in force. Relatedly, plaintiff can claim no irreparable harm absent an injunction, as the only relief now available to plaintiff's money and damages that could possibly be unpaid, resolve any payment disputes through any available administrative channels. In other words, according to the State Department, they have no recourse other than one court mechanism for back pay. And my suspicion is they're not going to even get that. Now, I don't know if that was just a letter, what we call a letter in isolation, if it was just the USCCB who got a letter like that, because they are far from the only Christian organization doing this. The Lutherans have a version of this, as do the Anglicans or the Episcopalians. Most of the more organized groups that call themselves Christians in the United States have something like this. This is just especially galling that the Catholic Church has this, because the Catholic Church actually has a formal body of teaching on this that the USCCB was just openly flaunting, and they were helping facilitate the flaunting of their own teaching on this. We've gone over what the Catechism says before. We've gone over what Pope said before Vatican II about this. It's one of those rare teachings of the Church, it seems like, on social issues that didn't change much, if at all, after Vatican II from before. The bishops know what the teaching is. They just don't care. They're just more interested in the money. And I'm not the only one who seems to get this, because we go to here Father James Altman, who had this to say on X. Publicized everywhere, the vile and corrupt USCCB. The corrupt bishops of the U.S. just permanently hurt themselves. The USCCB, as a client of USAID, must follow the Administrative Procedures Act in dispute. Instead, some bishops filed a lawsuit. Consequently, they lost their client status. I'm going to remind you, Father James Altman is a lawyer. He's a priest. He's also a trained lawyer. He understands this better than most of the people who write articles about this will understand this. It said some bishops filed a lawsuit. Consequently, they lost their client status. In other words, they get no more of our tax dollars to aid and abet their treasonous crimes against the people. Do not be fooled. As much as 74% of Catholic Charities' revenues went to salaries and benefits for employees, another percentage to those unwelcome visitors, leaving only a smaller percentage to help poor American citizens. The corrupt and anti-Catholic USCCB just defunded itself. Through their pervert hiding and sweeping away of things, through locking faithful Catholics out of God's churches, that's a reference to 2020 and 2021, they already lost the financial support of the faithful. Now they lost the taxpayers' money train. They finally bankrupted the diocese, so watch the property sell-off accelerate. The entirety of U.S. cardinals and bishops should resign in disgrace. Pretty characteristic of how Father James Altman will characterize things. He's not one known for being diplomatic when it comes to betrayals of the faith like this. This is, as David Wilson says, a sense of entitlement, and it gets to people. And this is connected to something we'll talk about that doesn't look like it's immediately related to this, but this is exactly what we're seeing. That is a sense of entitlement. And so we're not the only ones noticing this. This is a Catholic blogger named Shane Schatzel, I think. He realclearcatholic.com. He's a blogger. He posted this on X, and I thought this was a great take on this. He says, I personally believe the USCCB just needs to be dissolved. It's way too corrupt and cannot be reformed. Since it doesn't have any real ecclesiastical power or authority, which is true, they are a non-canonical organization, I think the best thing to do is just get rid of it. Wait a few years, then make something new that has a more clearly and narrowly defined role. It should be smaller and should not speak on behalf of all bishops. I propose we go back to the old Baltimore conference system, get everything out of the swamp, DC, and bring it all back to America's first see in Baltimore. Now, for those who don't know, the first diocese in the United States, the primary see is Baltimore. That's why it's like an honorific to be named the Archbishop of Baltimore still, even though it's kind of a traditional thing now, not and not it's clearly not the preeminent see in terms of how many Catholics there are and everything else. But the Archbishop of Baltimore always has a lot of influence because he's the Archbishop of Baltimore. There's a lot of history involved in that. The first 3 or 4 archdioceses in the United States actually were ones that would leave your head scratching. if you, for those who don't know, but his proposal is we get back to, because every year the bishops meet in Baltimore, and essentially wants to go back to the pre-conciliar way of them meeting periodically to discuss major things. He says, set it up as the American Conference of Catholic Bishops in Baltimore and have a meeting once every 5 years to discuss appropriate issues. Beyond that, the ACCB just catalogs Catholic places of worship and runs a website so people can easily find them, pretty much like they do now. The ACCB can then make public via their website pertinent Catholic documents, the Catechism, the Bible, bishops' documents, pretty much like they do now. What will be different is that the ACCB should be apolitical. It should make no political or social statements on behalf of the American bishops. It should also take no money from the government. Rather, bishops are responsible for their own statements of this type and charitable outreaches. I really do believe this is the best possible solution, and it's probably the most Catholic solution as well, subsidiarity, which is something from Catholic social teaching that says decisions should be made at the most local place possible. The most local place possible when in reality is at the individual or family level. You have a duty to help your neighbor. Your government doesn't necessarily have a duty to help your neighbor if you can do it yourself. Okay. You have a duty to act first. It's a subsidiarity. And it goes on all through every conceivable level of government action where, if you can't help, then maybe the people who live on your street should be able to help somebody. Take it to your parish after that, or take it to your town level after that, then take it to like the region or the state or the province or whatever to the federal government. And then only after, if whatever the problem is so enormous that you need international cooperation to deal with it, like say the thermometer problem, that pet project of Pope Francis's, then you would then argue for international cooperation on something. But if like your neighbor needs help, it's more incumbent on his family and neighbors to help than it is on some distant political body. That's the point below. And he's sharing this with the context of the life site asking if the USCCB has become a political institution. And the answer to that question is, so obviously, yes, so we're not going to bother going over it. And well, Damien Keller with the super chat is appreciated. Seems like profits about to be fulfilled that to pay their debt, they'll strip altars and sell church property. I mean, they've been doing that since the 60s. I mean, go back to after Vatican II, what they were doing. Older Catholics will remember when their parishes were stripped bare of a lot of statues and artwork and high altars like you see at a traditional parish and at some cathedrals still in some older parishes where the priests who ran it had more sense than to get caught up in the spirit of the age. A lot of them, they destroyed those high altars to put in those table altars that you now see for the Novus Ordo. Now I could see this ramping up. This is why you have all these stories of nuns getting crushed by their dioceses and their bishops to sell off their property. And I've got a story for you on that I'll be covering here in the next few days. That's unfolding because that's another story involving new nuns having this done to them. But you may be right in that this will be how they respond, is to consolidate parishes and sell property because they're out of money and they are ideologically driven to keep this going. Now, this is also related to something else, though, and it's rather simple. People ask, why is it that people are leaving the faith? And it's not just the faith like the Catholic Church, which is the true faith, but also all the schismatic groups that broke off from it, all the Protestants and everything else. When you look at the state of the modern world and Christianity in general, it's not good, no matter how hard our bishops try to paint things in rosy terminology that we are living in a new springtime. People believe that their church leaders have become politicians, that they go to mass or wherever, or if they're not a Catholic, they go to whatever it is they do on a Sunday, and they're not hearing the gospel. And there's a lot of reasons for this. It's what in public policy we would call a wicked problem, meaning a problem with so many different factors into it that you can't address it really by finding one simple solution. You have to really address this very complex problem with complex solutions. But one of the big drivers of this is the politicization of the faith. And you'll remember that several years ago, Pew Research did a survey of religion in America. they released a new one just a few days ago, and the numbers are bleak, especially for Catholics, but for Christians in general. Several years ago, in the before times of 2019, Pew Research put out a survey showing only 1 in 3 Catholics believe what the church actually teaches about the Eucharist, meaning that 2 in 3 Catholics are material heretics, if not formal heretics. The bishops have done such a terrible job of teaching the faith that we don't know if people actually know what the church teaches about things other than being nice and voting in a way that your super liberal and morally suspect and probably James Martin type bishop tells you to vote for by implication. But at least most Catholics, it seems, are material heretics because they deny the belief in the real presence of the Eucharist, that the Eucharist is truly Jesus Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity, truly present. People, Catholics, 2 out of 3 of them believe that it's just a symbol. They would be formal heretics and no longer Catholic if they knowingly rejected what the church teaches about the Eucharist. But again, most don't know. That survey has been the subject of intense debate for the past 6 years. This survey result got initially in 2019, the bishops to do 2 things. One, they did a survey themselves. They gave much rosier numbers about the real presence. And when you look at the survey methods, it's suspect at best. But the other thing, and it tells you that they know their own survey wasn't real, they decided to launch this Eucharistic revival where they did processions and weird rock concert like get-togethers in stadiums and all sorts of things. They spent millions of dollars on this thing with the hope that this would help revive belief in the real presence. Personally, I didn't like what they did it and how they did it, but at least they did something, which is better than what most would do. But to solve this problem, you need your priests on Sunday to stand up at the ambo and teach what the Eucharist is, and teach the hard truth that if you do not believe what the church says the Eucharist is, then do not come up and receive. This would also require, by the way, teaching about the 4 last things and teaching about what happens if you're not in a state of grace and you receive the Eucharist invalidly, which then requires you to teach about sin. You begin to see how big of a problem this is and how there are so many factors just in the lack of belief in the real presence that it's a complex issue by itself to fix. Well, I'm telling you this now because the Pew Research decided that they didn't want to miss out on this debate, so they did another survey, and they put it out just a couple of days ago, and it's about religion, but Christianity broadly in the United States, and the numbers are pretty bad. So Eric Sammons posted this on X. Let me see if I can pull this up here. He posted the following here to X, and it's amazing. It says, according to a recent Pew survey, again from like 2 or 3 days ago, and I'll show you in a second, for every 100 people who enter the Catholic Church in America, 840 leave. Let's say that again. For every 100 people who enter the Catholic Church in America, 840 leave. This is a 1530s Europe level crisis, and Catholics can't put their heads in the sand and pretend everything is awesome. We need a new Catholic Reformation. Now, some people will immediately blanch when he says Catholic Reformation. The term that most people are used to hearing is the Counter-Reformation. He's calling it a Reformation because, as you will see when somebody calls him out on it in the thread, that the actual Reformation was not a Reformation. It was a revolt against Christ. That's what it was. And replacing Catholicism with a man-made religion built on the 5 false premises of Protestantism and all the rest of it. But here, this is like a screenshot right out of their survey. 100 enter the church, 840 leave. And it's amazing. It's amazing, but it's not surprising. Not at all. And that's the Pew survey. They publish this on their website. You can take a look at it if you want to. I'll put a link in my show notes at returntotradition.org. It's from the Pew Research Center, published at the 26th of February. That's 2 days ago. We're not going to go over the whole thing. The thing is gigantic. Here's part of the executive summary. The 2023-24 Religious Landscape Study and other Pew Research Center polling find that the Christian share of the population after years of decline has been relatively stable since 2019. And the religiously unaffiliated population after rising rapidly for decades has leveled off, at least temporarily, at present. 62% of U.S. adults describe themselves as Christian, 40% are Protestant, 19% are Catholic, and 3% are other Christians. 29% are religiously unaffiliated, 5% are atheist, 6% are agnostic, 19% identify as nothing in particular. 7% belong to religions other than Christianity, and it goes into the numbers. Some key measures of religious belief and practice also have held fairly steady in recent years. They found that 44% of U.S. adults say they pray at least once a day. Though down significantly since 2007, this measure has held between 44 and 46% since 2021. 33% say they go to religious service at least once a month. Think about that for a moment in terms of the Sunday obligation. 33% of Christians say they only go to church services of some kind at least once a month. Since 2020, the percentages saying this have consistently hovered in the low 30s. And large majorities of Americans have a spiritual, supernatural outlook. For example, 86% believe people have a soul or spirit in addition to their physical body. 83% believe in God or a universal spirit. 79% believe there's something spiritual beyond the natural world. 70% believe in heaven, hell, or both. But in future years, we may see further decline in the religiousness of American public for several reasons. This is where it gets bad. Young adults are far less religious than older adults. No recent birth cohort has become more religious as it has aged. The stickiness of a religious upbringing seems to be declining. Compared with older people, fewer young adults who had a highly religious upbringing are still highly religious as adults. The stickiness of a non-religious upbringing seems to be rising, meaning, in plain language, people raised in a religious household, they're not sticking with their religion as much as they used to. People raised in a non-religious household are sticking with their religion or lack thereof more than they used to. That's alarming. This is the third time Pew Research Center has conducted a religious landscape study. The first was conducted in 2007, the second in 2014. Other key findings from the new study include 35% of U.S. adults have switched religion since childhood, leading to net gains for the unaffiliated population and net losses for the Christian population. All three major strands of Protestantism have declined in percentage terms since 2007. Evangelical Protestants now make up 23% of U.S. adults, down from 26%. Mainline Protestants account for 11% of U.S. adults, down from 18%. Members of historically black Protestant churches make up 5% of U.S. adults, down from 7%. And it goes on like that. And they don't give you those numbers for the Catholic Church, and I don't know why that is. It breaks it down by gender. Women are more religious than men. We've known that. Just go look at who's sitting in the pews of your typical ordinary form parish. The share of self-described political liberals who identify as Christians has fallen 25% points from 2007, from 62% to 37%. That will shock no one who's paying attention. Among self-described conservatives, Christian share has declined 7 points from 89 to 82%. And it goes on like this. That should surprise exactly nobody. But that tells you that tells you what's at the heart of what's going on. And if you want to know why that's going on, if you want to see why people are leaving the faith, one reason, among many, it is a wicked problem, besides not actually being taught the faith, which is probably the core of the wicked problem, is this. Far too many of our bishops are glorified politicians. Case in point, this story broke, and it's a kind of a head scratcher. Headline from Crux. No plans to see Trump, but new DC prelate just had lengthy call with Biden. And that is Cardinal Robert McElroy. He's not considered papabile by most people, but if he's the one who emerged on the loggia in the next conclave, get on your knees and pray for mercy. Now, he's an American, so his chances of becoming pope are next to zero, like Cardinal Dolan, thanks be to God. But get on your knees and beg for mercy if he is the one who shows up on the loggia. This is a bizarre story. Why would Cardinal McElroy meet with the former president and say doesn't have any plans to meet with the current? That's weird, especially since he is the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., and at least in the post-conciliar era, all of his predecessors going back to the 60s would meet with the president or representative of his. He's saying he has no plans to do that. That's a little weird. Let's go take a look at the article. Moments after stating that he has no present plans to meet with President Donald Trump, emphasizing what he stressed is the intrinsically pastoral and not political role of the Archbishop of Washington. When it suits his political purposes, he'll say that. Cardinal Robert McElroy revealed he recently held a lengthy call with former President Joe Biden. I'm going to Washington as the Archbishop of Washington, which is a pastoral role, McElroy said. That is, my role is the leadership of the Catholic community of Washington and all that brings with it, he said, noting that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is the church's primary government liaison. Fact check, dubious. Yet moments later, McElroy said that he had a lengthy call with President Biden the other day. He didn't reveal what was discussed on the call other than saying that Biden asked about Pope Francis's health and said he's been praying for the pontiff. Some may see the contrast between spurning Trump while chatting casually with Biden as consistent with McElroy's reputation, seen as a close ally of Pope Francis and one of the nation's more progressive prelates. McElroy made the comments at a February 27th news conference, scheduled as his final one as the Bishop of the Diocese of San Diego before he departs for the nation's capital in just a few weeks. McElroy worried out loud about the nation, quote, being turned upside down, but by and large focused on Pope Francis and his time in San Diego while looking ahead to Washington, end quote. If you actually go watch his press conference, you'll see that Cardinal McElroy was saying a lot of political things were aimed at the current administration. And Crux, by the way, is a progressive modernist Catholic outlet. It's run by one of the dioceses, I think Boston, but it's a modernist outlet. It's a little better than America Magazine. They just tend to take a little bit straighter news line than America Magazine. But that's what's going on. And when you see this stuff, because the typical layperson is not a moron. When you see this stuff, you see your bishops being political actors on stage, and then they openly go against the interest of the country, and they openly go against what the church teaches on the hot button issue of the day. What do you think the results are going to be? I've seen in the course of this discussion about Catholic Charities, USAID, and the rest, many Catholics say that that's it, I'm gone. Most others say I'm not giving another dime to the church, that they will tithe in other ways, but they won't give money in any way that gets back to the bishops. Anything like that is a catastrophe of the bishop's own making. Go back to that story about the bishops having their funding cut off by the U.S. State Department, their contracts canceled. They had become so reliant on U.S. dollars that it supplanted and replaced our duty as Catholics to support the work of the church. And they acted like they knew that. They acted like what the laity wanted, which most of the time is simply, please teach the Catholic faith, uphold the Catholic faith, stand up for the truth of the faith in the public square. They act as if the gospel and the needs of the laity were replaced by political needs. And that's why the last person you want to see is Pope is probably McElroy. I'd say Cardinal Supich, but they're basically the same creature. But that's what would happen. Now, thankfully, their chances of becoming Pope are next to zero. And I say that now, and watch what will happen in the next conclave. Cardinal McElroy will step out on the loggia because that's just how life seems to work these days. But if you ever want to know why people leave, that's one of the main reasons. And I'll leave you with this. To borrow a line from Jon Stewart back when he was marginally funny about 30% of the time, Taylor Marshall posted this on X as your exhibit for why people leave. How is this a Catholic priest? And this is James Martin saying, "Dear friends, I'm happy to share with you a new painting of Bishop Mary Ann Budd, by my friend, the Catholic priest and artist, Father William Hart McNichols, as well as reflection on his new image." If you don't remember who that is, right after taking the oath of office, there was a thing at the National Cathedral, which is an Episcopalian cathedral. She is the quote bishop of the Episcopalian cathedral, and she lectured him and J.D. Vance to their face about all the hot button issues of the day during her homily. Bishop. Utterly null and void holy orders for a whole lot of reasons, including the most obvious one right in front of your face. This is Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church promoting her. Church has ruled explicitly over and over again on ordaining the ladies, how it's not possible, and has explicitly said Anglican holy orders are null and void. And you know who took that very seriously? The Anglicans did. Anglican bishops and priests quietly went out and found schismatic groups with valid holy orders to get their ordinations taken care of. But of course, she's not a bishop. She calls herself bishop, but she's not one. And there's Pastor Jimmy Martin celebrating it for political reasons, not for any legitimate reason. Raven Ray says the USCCB has truly overreached its authority and is becoming irrelevant as if it isn't already. They pretty much are. Philip says, in what is currently the U.S., the Diocese of San Juan de Puerto Rico was established in 1511. Yeah, but I mean, it's dicey. I know that one it's U.S. territory, but traditionally it's understood that Baltimore was the first see, and it is the first see. It's one that has the most preeminent status. Short Bus King says Rico. Well, here's the other thing nobody ever brings up. By suing the U.S. government in a lawsuit, there's this process called discovery, where both sides in the lawsuit get access to the records of each other that are pertain to what they're doing, which means the U.S. government now can request the records of the USCCB on anything to do with the question at hand, migration. Oops, that's dumb. That's why they should have tried to figure out another way around this. Or maybe they should have just stopped doing this thing that the people were overwhelmingly against. All right, folks. I'm curious what you think about this in the comments. Let me know in the comments what you think about all of this. And remember, please pray for the church, because men like McElroy, regardless of how everything plays out the next few weeks, men like McElroy will continue to have enormous influence for a very long time. And just pray that maybe if we get a new pope soon, that he is a pope who will give us better shepherds than men like McElroy and Supich and the rest. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.